The first sound was a bolt cycling, clean, mechanical, without ceremony, and 43 men went quiet. That was how Sergeant First Class Nadia Voss entered the story. Not with introduction. Not with rank being called to attention. Just the sound of a bolt. And then silence. Because something in the air had changed, and everyone on that range felt it before they understood it. She was 29 years old, 5'6", and she had driven 9 hours from Fort Bragg to Fort Benning in a 10-year-old Civic, with a cracked dashboard and a road atlas her father had given her the summer before he died. The atlas was from 2003. She still used it. She didn't trust GPS. She said it made people lazy about understanding where they actually were. The range master that morning was a chief warrant officer named Gareth Dunmore. He had been running marksmanship evaluations for 16 years. He had seen things go wrong in ways that would require paperwork for months afterward. He had the particular kind of patience that comes not from calm, but from having run out of surprise a long time ago. He looked at the manifest. He looked at Lane 9. He looked back at the manifest. "Voss," he said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." "You're qualified on the M110. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment the way experienced evaluators look at something that doesn't fit the pattern they've been running for 16 years. It wasn't hostility. It was closer to the expression a structural engineer makes when a load-bearing calculation comes back with a number he didn't expect. "Range goes hot at 0700, he said. "Distances start at 300, step up to 5, 8, then 1,000. Iron sights only for this rotation. Optics block is in maintenance." He said that last part carefully. Watching. She nodded. "Iron sights are fine." What Dunmore did not say, what he would not say until much later, when he was asked directly, was that he had already decided she would wash by the 500-yard mark. Not because he disliked her, not because he had anything against women in combat-adjacent roles, but because the 1,000-yard iron sight qualification was a different category of skill than most people understood, and he had seen highly decorated men fail it on their first rotation and some on their second. What he also did not know, what almost no one knew, because she had never spoken about it to anyone who wasn't directly in her chain of command, was that Nadia Voss had been shooting iron sights at 1,000 yards since she was 19 years old. Her father had taught her. And her father had been the best long-range shooter the Army had produced in his generation, and he had never received the recognition for it, and she had carried that fact in her chest like a stone for a decade, and she was here partly because of it. But that part of the story comes later. The range opened under a gray Virginia sky that couldn't decide between overcast and clear. The light was flat and unhelpful, the kind that flattens depth perception and makes distance estimation unreliable for shooters who depend on visual cues they've built up over years of consistent conditions. It was, in other words, a bad morning to shoot at 1,000 yards with iron sights. Nadia Voss set her position at lane 9, adjusted her sling, and took 3 breaths she didn't let anyone see her take. 300 yards. She put 5 rounds through a group that Dunmore later measured at just under 2 inches. He said nothing, made a mark on his clipboard. 500 yards. The group opened slightly, 2.5 inches, which was still, technically speaking, remarkable. At 500 yards with iron sights in flat light, most shooters were chasing a 3 to 4 inch group and calling it excellent. A specialist from the infantry unit, sharing the range that morning, leaned toward the man next to him and said something. The man next to him laughed quietly. Dunmore heard it. He didn't turn around. 800 yards. This is where iron sight shooting stops being about training and starts being about something harder to quantify. At 800 yards, a skilled shooter is no longer aiming at a target. He, or she, is calculating a relationship between variables: wind, mirage, barrel temperature, the shooter's own pulse rate, the precise moment between heartbeats when the body is as still as it is ever going to be. The human eye cannot resolve a standard silhouette target at 800 yards with any useful precision. What the shooter is doing is building a mental model, integrating variables the way an aircraft's autopilot integrates sensor inputs, and trusting that model to place a round through a space the eye cannot actually see. Nadia Voss understood this, not as metaphor but as mathematics. Her father had explained it that way, sitting behind a rifle on a ridge in eastern Montana when she was 15 years old, his voice patient and exact in the way of someone who has thought about something long enough that the language for it comes naturally. The rifle is not the tool. Your understanding of the system is the tool. The rifle is just how the answer reaches the target. At 800 yards, she put 5 rounds into a group that Dunmore had to measure twice, 1 3/4 inches. The range went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The earlier quiet had been the quiet of skepticism, the kind that waits for confirmation of what it already suspects. This was a different thing. This was the quiet of recalibration. The specialist who had said something at the 500-yard mark was not saying anything now. Dunmore made another mark on his clipboard. His face remained exactly as it had been, the structural engineer's expression, careful and unreadable. 1,000 yards, he said. You're up. There are things about a 1,000-yard iron sight shot that the civilian world does not have good language for, and this is not because the knowledge is secret, but because the experience has no equivalent in ordinary life. At 1,000 yards, the target is approximately the size of a human thumbnail held at arm's length. The iron sight aperture the shooter is looking through was designed for combat ranges. 300 yards, 400, in a pinch 500. At 1,000 yards, the entire target fits inside the front sight post with room to spare. The shooter is not in any conventional sense aiming. The shooter is doing something else, something that requires a quality of attention that is difficult to sustain, under observation, under time pressure, under the low-frequency awareness that 43 people are watching and waiting for a specific outcome. The wind had picked up slightly from the northwest, 3 to 4 miles per hour, variable. Nadia calculated the adjustment in the time it took most people to register that the wind had changed. She lay behind the rifle. She slowed her breathing. She found the space between heartbeats. She waited. The first round left the barrel with a sound like a door being slammed in a distant room. Downrange, a target fell. Then another. Then 3 more in a sequence so deliberate it looked choreographed, as if the targets had been briefed in advance on the timing. Dunmore walked to lane 9 and stood there for a moment, looking at his clipboard, looking downrange, looking at the shooter, who was already clearing the weapon with the same economy of movement she'd brought to everything else that morning. 5 for 5, he said. She straightened, looked at him. Yes, sir. At 1,000 yards. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment. Where did you learn to shoot iron sights at 1,000 yards? And here, this is the part of the story that most people never got to, because the story they told about Nadia Voss was a simpler one. The one that started and ended at the range that morning and fit neatly into the kind of narrative that travels well in unit common areas and gets attached to people's names in the particular shorthand of military reputation. She's the one who shot 5 for 5 at 1,000 with iron sights. That one, that's the story that spread. The other story, the one that explained the first story, was harder to tell and required, sitting with more complexity than compressed narratives allow. She told Dunmore anyway. Her father's name was Chief Warrant Officer 2nd Class Leonard Voss. He had served 3 combat deployments, 2 in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, as part of a long-range surveillance element whose specific activities were not fully declassified until 2019. During his second deployment, in Kunar Province in 2009, he had performed an action that his commanding officer at the time, a lieutenant colonel named Garfield Cray, had recommended for the Silver Star. The recommendation had been submitted correctly. The supporting documentation had been assembled correctly. The witnesses had provided statements correctly. The Silver Star had never been awarded. The reasons for this, the actual reasons, the documented sequence of events between submission and the permanent disappearance of that recommendation into the administrative machinery of a forward-deployed headquarters took Nadia Voss 11 years to reconstruct. She did it the way her father had taught her to shoot, patiently, systematically, with the understanding that precision requires time and that rushing produces groups that open at the edges. What she found, eventually, was a major named Philip Stander. Stander had been the personnel officer at the relevant headquarters during the relevant period. He was, by 2009, a man with 17 years of service and a career that had plateaued at a grade that felt, to him, like an accusation. He had graduated in the middle of his West Point class. He had been passed over for a command position twice. He had watched people who had entered service the same year he did collect decorations and early promotions, while his own file accumulated the quiet bureaucratic residue of a career spent in supporting roles. Leonard Voss was everything Stander was not. He came up through the warrant officer pipeline, which meant he had never competed directly with Stander and never would. He had no interest in the politics of military advancement. He was, by every account of the people who served with him, simply exceptional, a natural, the kind of shooter and tactician that appears rarely enough that people remember exactly where they were when they first saw him work. The Silver Star recommendation went through Stander's office on a Tuesday morning in March of 2010. The investigation, conducted 31 years later, the one Nadia Voss had spent the better part of a decade, forcing into existence through a series of Freedom of Information requests, congressional inquiries, and a persistence that her supervisors had alternately admired and found professionally inconvenient, established that the recommendation had been received, logged, and then reclassified as incomplete on the basis of a documentation requirement that did not in fact exist in the applicable regulation. Stander had retired in 2014. He was living in Tucson. He had never been investigated for any misconduct related to awards processing because no one had ever looked, until Nadia did. Her father had died in 2017. Pancreatic cancer, which moves fast and does not negotiate. He was 53 years old. He died knowing about the Silver Star recommendation. His former CO, Garfield Cray, had told him about it years earlier, and the knowledge had sat in him for the rest of his life as a particular kind of unresolved thing. Not bitterness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a door you know should have opened and never did. What he did not know, what Nadia had decided, with the specific quiet stubbornness that people who knew both of them recognized as unmistakably his, was that she was going to find out why. She had enlisted at 20. By 25, she was an E6 with a marksmanship record that her own chain of command treated with the careful respect people apply to things they can't fully explain. By 27, she was in a role that required clearances she couldn't discuss at family gatherings, which had to become smaller gatherings since her father died, since her mother's remarriage, since the particular dispersion that follows loss and doesn't fully reverse. She drove the 9 hours alone because she had learned to be comfortable with solitude and long drives, which her father had also taught her, on the same roads in eastern Montana where he'd taught her to shoot. She carried the road atlas because it had been his. The investigation into the Voss Silver Star recommendation was formally reopened in the spring of 2023, following a letter from a congressional representative whose legislative assistant had spent 6 weeks reading through the documentation Nadia had assembled and concluded that it was, in the assistant's words, the most organized grievance I have ever encountered in this office. Dunmore testified as a character witness, not because he was asked to, but because he drove to Washington specifically to do it, which was the kind of thing he apparently did. Stander's conduct was reviewed. The review concluded that there was sufficient evidence of deliberate administrative interference to warrant formal findings, which were entered into the record, and which, because Stander was retired, carried no disciplinary consequence but existed permanently as an official accounting of what had happened. This is the part that some people find unsatisfying because the ending they want, the ending where Stander faces a consequence proportional to the harm he caused, is not the ending that administrative and legal processes produce, and never has been. The machinery of institutional accountability is slow and partial, and it arrives, when it arrives at all, in forms that don't look like justice the way justice looks in narrative. What it produced in this case was a ceremony. Fort Myer, Virginia. A November morning, the kind that was cold without being severe, the sky clear enough to produce actual shadows on the parade ground for the first time in a week. Nadia Voss stood in her dress uniform and watched a general whose name she had known from documents long before she knew his face pin a silver star to a shadow box that also contained her father's photograph. The one from his second deployment, before the weight loss, before the exhaustion had settled permanently into the lines around his eyes, and a small piece of the Montana landscape a pressed stem of wild rye from the ridge where he had taught her to shoot. She had put the rye there herself. She hadn't told anyone she was going to do it. The general said the words. The words were correct and appropriate and meant sincerely, and they were also words assembled from a formal vocabulary that exists specifically for moments that exceed the capacity of ordinary language, which is what formal ceremony is for. Nadia did not cry during the ceremony. She had learned, in the specific training that had preceded her current role, how to hold emotional weight in a way that didn't show on her face or in her posture, how to be present in a moment without being consumed by it. She cried afterward, in her car, parked behind the chapel on a side street where no one was likely to walk past. She cried for about 4 minutes, which was, she would have said if anyone had asked, approximately the right amount. Then she started the car. She had the road atlas open on the passenger seat to the page that showed the route from Arlington, Virginia, to Fort Benning, Georgia, where she had a marksmanship course scheduled for the following week that she had agreed to teach to a group of warrant officer candidates who were, by all accounts, talented and motivated and had no idea what was coming. She merged onto the highway. The light in November does a particular thing in the late afternoon in Virginia, comes in low and sideways, and turns everything it touches into something that looks more itself than it usually does. The highway, the trees, the brown fields on either side, the water tower in the middle distance with a county name she didn't recognize. Leonard Voss had spent a lot of time on roads like this. She knew that from the atlas, where certain routes were worn at the fold, in ways that only happen when a page has been opened to that section many times, in many different kinds of weather, over many different years. The silver star was behind her, in the shadow box, in the back seat. The road atlas was open on the passenger seat. She drove.